I know a couple of journalists who insist that when they're working, they are honest, unbiased, objective about what they write about. Now, when I speak to these journalists off duty, as it were, they strike me as opinionated, biased human beings that have a world view. So when they start work, it's as if they're trying to tell me they put on this superhero costume that gives them the power to be honest, objective and unbiased. Now, if they expect me to believe in that fantasy, then I'm afraid they're hugely mistaken. It's impossible for a reporter to write a story that is not unbiased. And I'm going to prove it in a series of video posts. Incidentally, before I start, have you noticed how the national news always comes packaged with the weather? Because the weather is neutral. It just falls out of the sky. It just happens. And a part of me thinks it's intentional to package that with the news so that people think the news is somehow neutral and unbiased. It just happens. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story that is allegorical about how the news media works. And it simplifies a very complex situation, which is exactly how the news works. When a journalist writes a report, they are simplifying a complex situation or a complicated situation. It's like a scale on a map, so that what you get is a map, not the territory. So I'll tell you this story and then I'll analyse it afterwards to illustrate where the bias comes in. I come home from work one afternoon and onto my street, and I bump into a neighbour who tells me there's been a fight on the street between two of the other neighbours. Mr. Patel and Mr. Smith have come to blows over a hedge that Mr. Patel was cutting, and Mr. Smith started to bully Mr. Patel and tell him how he should go about cutting this hedge, and Mr. Patel stood his ground. And so Mr. Smith then got annoyed and angry and escalated the situation to a point where they came to blows, and Mr. Patel sustained an injury, a bloody injury. Now, I know that this neighbour has got previous with Mr. Smith and she doesn't like him at all. So as she's telling me this story, I'm thinking, okay, she might be exaggerating a little the attitude of Mr. Smith. Anyway, sometime later I bump into another neighbour who I happen to know goes drinking with Mr. Smith and is quite friendly with him. And he tells me that there was an altercation on the street and Mr. Smith was trying to advise Mr. Patel on the best way to cut this hedge. And Mr. Patel took offence at this and became irrational and started to throw his weight around and got uppity. And Mr. Smith was simply trying to be helpful when Mr. Patel escalated the whole thing, became aggressive, and in the ensuing melee sustained an injury. He managed to catch his arm on one of the branches that he'd already cut and got a wound, a bloody wound. So it's like, okay, this is a different version to the story. So what I'm aware of is that there was some kind of incident, and the facts are it involved Mr. Patel, Mr. Smith and a hedge. The whys and wherefores of the incident, I'm not too sure about, to be honest, depending on who you spoke to. Anyway, later that evening, I'm watching the 6 o'clock national news, and Boris Johnson comes on the TV, and he starts telling this story of the incident that happened on the street, on my street. And two questions immediately spring to my mind. One, what the hell is this story doing on the national news? And the second one is, I happen to know from history and previous stories that Boris Johnson is a liar, a proven liar. So as he's telling the story, I'm having to apply a filter to what he's saying. How much of this do I believe and not believe? So that's the story. Now, several weeks later, I'm informed that a newsletter is going to be produced for the street. And if anyone has got a story, they need to send it to Mr. Smith. So I think, okay, I want to support my community. I will write a story about coming first, best in class for my onions at the annual Allotment Society show. So I write up my story, send it to Mr. Smith. Sometime later, a newsletter appears through my letterbox, and I read the newsletter, and it's full of stories about wrestling and motorcycles. That seems to be it. No stories about vegetables, alas. Now, I happened to bump into Mr. Smith later on, and I say to him, thanks for the newsletter, how come it's full of stories about wrestling and motorcycles? And Mr. Smith says, oh, I like wrestling. So any chance I get to include a story about wrestling, I put it in there. And my friends know I like wrestling, so they send me stories about wrestling. I said, what about vegetables? I said, I'm not really interested in vegetables, so I thought, thanks for your story, but I thought, I don't want to include that. So, what about the motorbike stories? Where have they come from? He said, the person who is funding the newsletter, he told me he wanted to include as many stories about motorcycles as I could fit in. Oh, I see. I didn't realise there was a fund. I assumed because there was a couple of ads in the newsletter, it was self-funded. Who's the funder then? He says that is Dread Pirate Pete, the leader of the local chapter of Hell's Angels. He's funding it. Right, I say. Okay. Several months later, one of the houses for sale on the street is bought by Dread Pirate Pete, who uses the house as a social club for his Hell's Angel mates. And so, in all hours, motorbikes are up and down the street. And I figure, I see, that's why I was funding the newsletter. He wanted people to get used to the idea of motorbikes and to have a favourable opinion about them, so that when lots of motorbikes appeared on the street, people were going to be okay about it. So that's the basic story. So what I'm going to do in the next video post is to analyse the story and to break it down, deconstruct it, and show you where the bias enters. So stay tuned and make sure to watch the other parts.